10,000 miles, no GPS, no phone. That's what it took to drive a truck from England to Iran in the 1970s. Thousands of British drivers did it anyway, crossing blizzards in Turkey and deserts in the Gulf, some never coming home. This is the road they called the toughest job in trucking. This journey did not start as an adventure. It started as a business problem that needed solving fast. In the 1970s, Iran was booming. Oil money was pouring into the country. Iran needed everything: medicine, car parts, factory equipment, whole production lines for new factories. The country did not have the industry to build all of this itself, so it turned to Europe to buy it. Getting these goods there by sea should have been simple, but it was not. In 1967, Egypt closed the Suez Canal during a war with Israel. That canal was the shortest sea route between Europe and the Middle East. With it closed, ships had to sail all the way around the bottom of Africa. That trip added weeks to every delivery and drove up shipping costs. The canal stayed shut for 8 years. British and European companies needed another way to move goods east. They found it on the road. A truck could leave England, cross Europe, pass through Turkey, and reach Iran in around 2 to 3 weeks. No canal, no slow ships, just diesel, tyres and nerve. For companies desperate to get cargo moving, this was the answer. This became known simply as the Middle East Run. It was not one company's idea. It grew out of necessity, and dozens of British haulage firms jumped in during the early 1970s, once word spread that the route worked and that the money was good. One of the most famous of these firms was a company called Astron. It started life as Asian Transport in 1964. His transport director, Bob Paul, was the one who actually hired the drivers. Bob called them his boys, whether they were his own employees or independent drivers working under contract. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Astron alone ran 25 of its own trucks and 50 to 60 trailers on this route, backed up by dozens of subcontractors doing the same run. Radcliffe Transport ran out of Farringdon in Oxfordshire. Redcliffe Roadways worked out of Mansfield and Sutton in Ashfield in Nottinghamshire. Oryx International operated from Strood in Kent. Smaller firms and lone owner drivers all wanted a piece of this new, profitable road to the Gulf. By the mid-1970s, thousands of British trucks were making this journey every single year. And it turned ordinary long-distance drivers into something closer to modern-day explorers. These trucks were never empty heading east. They rolled out of England loaded with British and European goods bound for the Gulf, factory machines, air conditioning units, clothing by the container load, furniture. Sometimes the cargo was even more unusual, with cars and smaller vehicles driven straight onto the back of larger trucks and hauled the entire distance. The trucks doing this hauling became legends of their own. Volvo built the F86, F88 and F89 models, and these were everywhere on the route by the mid-1970s. Drivers trusted them because they were built tough enough to survive broken roads, deep sand, and freezing mountain passes without falling apart. Scania sent its 110, 111, and 143 models down the same roads, known across the industry for engines that kept running no matter how hard they were pushed. British firms leaned on Seddon Atkinson trucks, ERF models, and the Ford Transcontinental, a truck built specifically with long European hauls in mind. Some companies still ran older Leyland trucks too, though drivers often said these struggled more once the snow and ice set in through the Turkish mountains. Life inside these cabs was nothing like driving a truck today. Drivers turned their cabs into mobile homes because there was simply nowhere else to stay for weeks at a time. Many welded steel storage boxes onto the truck frame. A small Primus stove let them cook basic meals wherever they happened to stop for the night. Whether that was a proper truck park or the side of a desert road, there was no fridge, no shower, no proper toilet, just a fold-out bed built into the cab, a stove, and whatever food would survive weeks of travel without spoiling in the heat. Many painted their front bumpers in bright colours and stripes, so friends could spot their truck from a distance at a crowded border post or a roadside stop. A few kept a mascot or a lucky charm on the dashboard for the whole journey. These small touches mattered on a job where a driver might not see a familiar face for weeks at a time. The truck was not just a machine. It was a home, a workshop, and sometimes the only steady thing a driver had for a month straight. The journey began at English ports, most often Dover, where trucks rolled onto ferries bound for the European mainland. From there, drivers pushed on through Belgium and West Germany, then crossed into Austria. Next came Yugoslavia and Bulgaria, both communist countries at the time, each with its own strict border checks, unfamiliar paperwork. Then came Turkey, and this single country could eat up a week or more of driving time because of its sheer size. Eastern Turkey held the most feared stretch of the entire journey. Drivers faced narrow mountain roads, thick ice, and blinding snow. One stretch became so notorious among drivers that it earned its own grim reputation, known to truckers as the Tahir Pass. Landslides and avalanches struck this road often, sometimes with no warning at all. Several drivers lost their lives here over the years, their trucks buried under snow or pushed clean off narrow mountain roads by falling rock. After clearing Turkey, drivers reached the border into Iran, most often crossing at a town called Bazagan. From there, some trucks continued on toward Tehran, while others turned south toward Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, or the growing Gulf state of Qatar. The desert stretches south of Iran brought a completely different kind of danger. Instead of ice and snow, drivers now faced blistering heat, shifting sand, and roads that sometimes disappeared entirely under drifting dunes. The full round trip covered close to 10,000 miles from door to door. Most drivers hoped to complete the whole journey in around a month. Some companies offered bonuses to any driver who managed the entire round trip in 28 days or less, which pushed drivers hard but also rewarded the toughest and most experienced men on the road. No matter how experienced the driver behind the wheel was, some drivers chose to ship their loaded trailers by sea for part of the journey instead of driving the entire distance by road. Ferries carried trucks and trailers across stretches of the Mediterranean toward ports in Syria, Lebanon, or Cyprus, cutting out some of the toughest desert, driving before the truck rolled off the ramp, and continued on toward its final destination by road. This mixed approach, part sea and part road, became common enough that several ferry companies built their entire business around hauling British and European trucks partway across this route. There was no such thing as a phone call home once you left Western Europe behind, no GPS to check your route, no app to find the nearest fuel stop or a warm meal. Drivers relied on paper maps, road signs written in languages they could not read, and word of mouth passed along from other truckers met at roadside stops and border crossings. CB radios became an absolute lifeline out on these roads. Drivers used them constantly, warning each other about washed-out roads ahead, blocked mountain passes, or trouble brewing at a particular border post. If your truck broke down alone in the desert or high in the mountains, that CB radio might be the only way to call for help from anyone within range. Vera crossings tested every driver's patience to its limit. Paperwork had to be exact, built around a customs document called a tire carnet, which allowed sealed truck trailers to pass through multiple countries without customs officers opening and searching the cargo at every single stop. Even with perfect paperwork, drivers could still find themselves stuck for days, waiting on a single guard to stamp a single form. Some drivers later admitted that a small bribe, quietly slipped to a border officer, could speed things along considerably. The rules on this varied enormously from country to country. German officials had a reputation for being strict and completely impossible to bribe. Officials in other countries were often far more willing to look the other way for the right price. Engines overheated under the desert sun. Tyres blew apart on rough, unpaved roads. Gearboxes failed in the cold, grinding climb through mountain passes. There was no roadside assistance number to call, no service waiting to come and rescue a stranded driver. Men fixed what they could themselves, using whatever spare parts they carried in those steel storage boxes, or they tracked down local mechanics who had often never worked on a British truck engine before in their lives. Despite every one of these hardships, drivers looked out for each other constantly. Truckers from completely different companies, and even different countries, would choose to travel together through the most dangerous stretches of road. If one truck broke down, others would stop without being asked, share food, or tow a stranded rig into the next town. None of this was required by any company rulebook. It was simply how the job worked out there. On a route this remote, another trucker was very often the only help a stranded driver had for hundreds of miles in any direction. This was never an easy job, dressed up to sound like an adventure. In June 1980, a brand new ferry called the MS Zenobia left Sweden on her very first voyage, carrying 104 fully loaded trucks bound for Syria. A fault in the ship's ballast system caused her to lean further and further to one side as the journey went on. Engineers fought to correct the problem, but after 3 tense days near the coast of Cyprus, the ship finally rolled onto her side and sank close to the port of Larnaca. Every crew member on board was safely rescued before she went down, but the trucks and their cargo, worth an estimated $200 million, sank with the ship. They remain there to this day, resting on the seabed off Larnaca, a strange and haunting underwater monument to this entire era of trucking. On land, the risks were just as real and just as constant. Drivers faced fatal accidents on the icy mountain roads of eastern Turkey, sudden desert sandstorms that could bury a stalled truck in hours, and long stretches of road with no guardrails above sheer drops. Every legendary run eventually comes to an end, and this one hit 2 hard stops within the space of just 2 years. The first was the Iranian Revolution in 1979. The entire government of Iran changed, almost overnight by historical standards, and the country closed itself off from much of the outside world that it had been trading with so freely for over a decade. Business routines that British companies had relied on for years fell apart almost instantly. Many haulage firms pulled their trucks and their drivers back from Iran completely, unwilling to risk men and vehicles in a country now going through violent upheaval. Families of drivers who lived through this era say plainly that this single event marked the true beginning of the end for the golden years of the run. The second blow landed in September 1980, when full-scale war broke out between Iran and Iraq. Iraq's own commercial ports were shut down almost entirely by the fighting, the roads that dragged on for 8 brutal years. Safely now sat inside an active war zone, with the constant risk of violence never far away. One by one, companies pulled their drivers out of the region entirely rather than risk their lives on roads that were no longer safe at any price. The golden years of the Middle East run were effectively over. Even once the fighting eventually slowed and a shaky peace returned to the region, the wider world of international shipping had already moved on without this route. By the late 1980s, the great era of British trucks crossing deserts and mountains to reach Tehran was, for the most part, finished for good. A handful of drivers and companies carried on into the 1990s in a smaller, quieter way, but the route never returned to the scale or the legend it had built during those first wild years in the 1970s. A 1978 BBC documentary called Destination Doha captured some of these very journeys on film, following Astron's drivers across the mountains of Iran and the deserts of Saudi Arabia on their way to the growing Gulf state of Qatar. Books have since been written by the drivers themselves, describing narrow mountain passes, sudden desert breakdowns, and the strange, heavy loneliness of driving thousands of miles with nobody but a crackling CB radio for company through the night. What makes this story so powerful is not simply the distance covered or the danger faced along the way. It is what these drivers proved was actually possible with almost nothing behind them. With little more than a truck, a paper map, and raw determination, ordinary working men crossed entire continents that most people back home would never have dared to drive through, even once in their lives. No satellite tracking to watch over them. No mobile phone to call for help. No modern safety net waiting below if something went badly wrong. Just skill, hard-earned experience, and deep trust in the other drivers sharing that same lonely road. The Middle East run stands today as one of the toughest anywhere in the world. It demanded absolutely everything a driver had to give. And in return, it gave back stories that are still being told, truck stop to truck stop, family to family, decades after the very last British lorry finally crossed the border into Iran. That is why, even now, this legendary road to Tehran refuses to be forgotten.